If Cuba's regime collapses, China faces a critical decision: evacuate intelligence assets from 4 signal intelligence facilities before US forces arrive, or implement scorched earth protocols and destroy everything. Washington prepares teams to recover intact databases, collection logs spanning years, communications archives, technical specifications. Beijing calculates Y-20 airlift capacity, how many sorties, how many days before American troops breach the perimeter at Bejukal. Moscow deploys nuclear submarines as strategic signaling, demonstrating that Russian interests persist even when Russian leverage doesn't. Meanwhile, Cuban military commanders face a choice: facilitate Chinese evacuation and maintain Beijing's goodwill, or cooperate with US seizure operations and secure American backing for whoever comes next. This isn't hypothetical. It's February 2026. Cuba's regime faces economic collapse. Peso down 10% in 3 weeks. Oil supply terminated following Maduro's capture. Trump tariffs targeting any country selling petroleum to Havana. China operates 4 active signal intelligence facilities we can map through satellite imagery. US military forces surged 11,000 troops to the region. The Lord's Protocol, the race to secure or destroy surveillance infrastructure before it changes hands, is the crisis scenario where Cold War precedent meets 21st century great power competition. Here's what the technical evidence actually shows. Start with Bejukal, the largest active Cuban signal intelligence complex documented by satellite analysis. During the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, nearby sites housed Soviet nuclear weapons. For decades, Bejukal appeared in congressional testimony, unclassified government documents, Spanish-language media reports. Senator Marco Rubio called publicly on Havana to kick out this Chinese listening station during 2016 presidential debates. Satellite imagery from March 2024 revealed major infrastructure updates. Underground facility entrances visible on the southern perimeter, construction dates between 2010 and 2019. New radome added March 2024, potentially concealing radar or electronic intelligence systems. But the critical development came April 2025. Analysts documented construction of a new circularly disposed antenna array on Bejukal's northern perimeter. 19 antennas arranged in a circle, 175 meters in diameter, replacing the previous array's 16 antennas spanning just 85 meters. CDAAs aren't telecommunications infrastructure. They're specialized signal intelligence collection tools for high-frequency direction finding, pinpointing the origin of radio signals from 3,000 to 8,000 miles away. That diameter matters. The larger the circle, the greater the precision tracking signals at extended ranges. Bejukal's new CDAA provides capability to monitor air and maritime activity across US territory, track signals from Florida military installations 90 miles north. 500 miles southeast near El Salao, satellite imagery identified a previously unreported facility. When CSIS analyzed 2,900 square kilometers of satellite coverage, they found a large CDAA under construction beginning 2021, projected diameter 130 to 200 meters. As of April 2025, work at El Salao had largely ceased. Graded areas within the CDAA's rings becoming reclaimed by vegetation. Yet proximity to the Moncada cement plant, inaugurated 2018 as part of Chinese finance cement industry revitalization, suggests logistical connection. Social media photographs show Moncada workers involved at the El Salao site. Once completed, this facility will monitor US Navy operations throughout the Caribbean and potentially the South Atlantic. 10 kilometers north of Bejukal sits Wajay. Security fencing, 2 guard posts, gradual expansion over 20 years. Single antenna in 2002, growing to 12 antennas of varying sizes by 2025, plus operations facilities and a solar farm, insurance against Cuba's unreliable electrical grid. No dish antennas visible, suggesting terrestrial signal interception rather than satellite communications collection. Near Wajay, the Kala Bazar complex hosts a dozen dish antennas and 2 pole antenna arrays. The number, location, and orientation shifted considerably over time, adjusting to evolving mission. Newest dish antenna installed 2016, indicating continued modernization. 4 facilities, specific locations, less than 100 miles south of Florida. Geographic advantage explains the persistence. Signal intelligence transmission, geophysics favor Cuba's elevated island position overlooking populated American coastlines. Radio signals become difficult to isolate over long distances. Radar requires line of sight. Cuba commands approaches to the Panama Canal, Caribbean sea lanes, South Atlantic routes, and overlooks approximately 20 key Florida military installations. Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, Kennedy Space Center, Central Command Headquarters, Southern Command Headquarters, Naval Air Station Pensacola, Tyndall Air Force Base, MacDill, Kings Bay Submarine Base. What satellite imagery confirms: facility locations, CDAA specifications, construction timelines, antenna configurations, underground facility entrances. What remains uncertain: specific collection targets, Chinese personnel numbers, exact data sharing protocols between Beijing and Havana, operational chain of command. What technical characteristics reveal: 175-meter CDAA diameter equals precision tracking at 3,000 to 8,000 miles. Satellite tracking capability for Kennedy and Cape Canaveral launches equals telemetry and flight path intelligence. Multiple antenna types across 4 facilities equals complex signal intelligence mission covering satellite downlinks, radio traffic, commercial communications. Now let's trace how this surveillance network emerged and what Cold War precedent tells us about how it could end. The Soviets established LORDS in 1964, 2 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis nearly triggered nuclear war. 28 square miles, 1,000 to 1,500 Russian engineers and military personnel, the largest Soviet electronic eavesdropping installation outside Soviet territory. For 37 years, LORDS monitored all US military and civilian geosynchronous communication satellites, intercepted White House communications, NASA and Air Force Cape Canaveral telemetry, financial wire services, military communications links. Cuban Defense Minister Raúl Castro claimed in 1993 that Russia obtained 75% of its military strategic information from LORDS. Unprotected US telephone communications systematically intercepted, providing support for Russian economic espionage and identifying potential espionage recruits through personal information extraction. Putin announced LORDS closure in October 2001, presenting it domestically as economizing measure, freeing defense ministry funding for military reform. Most observers suggested Putin timed the announcement to support Russian-US rapprochement, following the Kremlin's enlistment in Washington's campaign against terrorism. LORDS had been friction point. Some US lawmakers called for linking aid to Russia to facility closure. Havana reacted angrily. Cuba charged Moscow approximately $200 million annually to rent the facility. The evacuation logistics established precedent. Dismantling began January 2002, completed by month's end. 3 Antonov An-124 cargo transport aircraft dispatched to return equipment to Russia. The An-124, maximum cargo capacity approximately 150 tons, cargo hold dimensions accommodating major antenna systems, electrical generation equipment, control stations, technical infrastructure, timeline approximately 30 days total. Then came the gap. For 12 years, no Russian presence at LORDS, until July 2014, when Moscow and Havana reached agreement to reopen the facility, finalized during Putin's visit. Russia forgave approximately 90% of Cuba's $32 billion debt. By 2023, the University of Informatic Sciences, located on the former LORDS site, became hub for Russian intelligence personnel again. What the LORDS precedent reveals: facility lifecycle pattern spans establishment, peak operation, closure for strategic reasons, evacuation logistics, gap period, reactivation under new geopolitical conditions. Surveillance infrastructure survives regime changes, economic collapses, superpower realignments. Geographic advantage: Cuba's position 90 miles from Florida creates enduring collection value regardless of which power operates facilities. The Soviets built LORDS, operated it 37 years, evacuated in 30 days, came back 13 years later. Now China's built 4 facilities with technical capabilities surpassing Cold War architecture. Rumors trace to 1999, when China's Minister of Defense Chi Haotian visited Cuba, met Raúl Castro. Media reports suggested he negotiated access to former Soviet eavesdropping facilities, potentially including LORDS. June 2023, Wall Street Journal reported China invested heavily in cash-strapped Cuba in exchange for signal intelligence facility access, negotiated agreement to train Chinese military personnel on the island's northern side. Biden administration confirmed Chinese operatives had operated an intelligence facility for some time, upgraded in 2019. Administration characterized reports of China building the base as not entirely accurate, left unclear how much PRC investment funded 2019 upgrade versus November 2023 debt restructuring credits. This fits Project 141, classified military logistics support network aiming for at least 5 overseas bases, 10 logistical support sites by 2030. Pentagon analysis indicates PLA already clearly getting some use out of newly constructed facilities even when incomplete. Geographic focus, securing strategic choke points and sea lanes connecting mainland to export markets and energy sources. Cuba's facilities provide unique capability unavailable from Chinese territory. Collecting data on US rocket launches from Kennedy Space Center, Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, provides privileged insight into flight paths and telemetry, information of keen interest as China works to catch up to American space launch technology. Capability to intercept data delivered by US satellites passing over highly sensitive military sites across southern United States. Florida hosts Cape Canaveral Complex, Central Command and Southern Command headquarters, multiple submarine and military bases. Intercepting commercial communications through vital economic centers provides access to unencrypted commercial data, treasure trove less restricted by encryption than military communications. Even limited access to Cuban facilities gives China far greater ability to monitor and communicate with own space assets, passing over the other side of the globe. China historically lacked ground stations in North America. Cuban installations close that strategic gap. Increasingly significant as China expands satellite constellation, reconnaissance, early warning, communication satellites. Beijing-tied firms, Huawei and ZTE, both blacklisted by US government over espionage risks, now form backbone of Cuba's telecommunications infrastructure, provide 5G systems, routers, networking equipment across the island. Frequent technical exchanges between Cuban and Chinese state-backed universities facilitate technology transfer, potentially provide cover for intelligence activities. China's 2017 national intelligence law requires even private firms to cooperate with state intelligence efforts, fundamentally undermines assumptions about independence of nominally commercial entities. Cuba's dire economic circumstances, lacking resources for independent telecommunications development, create conditions where Beijing leverages infrastructure to support signal intelligence collection. China built 4 facilities surpassing Soviet lords. Beijing embedded itself in Cuba's telecommunications infrastructure. Now Russia's approach, military signaling more symbolic than substantive, but carrying escalation risks. June 12, 2024, nuclear-powered submarine K-561 Kazan, 885M Yassin M class, arrived Havana Harbor accompanied by frigate Admiral Gorshkov, tug, auxiliary tanker. First formal Russian nuclear submarine visit to Cuba since Soviet Union's 1991 dissolution. Kazan, 4th-generation nuclear cruise missile submarine, 13,800 ton submerged displacement, 658-meter maximum depth, 64 officers and sailors, 8 missile silos with vertical launching systems carrying up to 32 Onyx anti-ship missiles or 40 caliber cruise missiles, 10 533mm torpedo tubes, caliber ranges exceeding 1,000 nautical miles, long-range land attack capability against targets across US territory. June 13, 2024, USS Helena, Los Angeles-class attack submarine, arrived Guantanamo Bay Naval Base. Southern Command released statement confirming deployment. Unusual decision to disclose submarine movement. Timing sparked interpretation as direct confrontation between US and Russian nuclear submarines in Caribbean for first time since Cold War's end. 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, US Coast Guard cutter Stone, HMCS, Ville de Quebec, remained close behind Russian vessels. Pentagon described Russian naval activity as routine, stated not concerned by Russia's deployments, which pose no direct threat to United States. Cuba, Russia, US officials emphasized no nuclear weapons deployed on Kazan or Admiral Gorshkov. Yet strategic symbolism exceeded actual threat. Russia reasserted presence in traditional Caribbean sphere, demonstrated continued technical capability to operate advanced platforms despite Ukraine war resource constraints, conveyed to Washington that Moscow retains capacity for strategic signaling and potential escalation. October 2025, Russia's Federation Council ratified intergovernmental agreement on military cooperation with Cuba, provides legal grounds to define bilateral military cooperation. Document contains no operational details. Pro-Kremlin commentators speculated about Moscow deploying Oreshnik missiles on Cuban soil. Russian analysts acknowledge such claims primarily rhetorical, illustrating Kremlin use of strategic signaling to evoke Cold War imagery, pressure US through psychological escalation rather than actual deployment. Russia-Cuba cooperation largely transactional and symbolic rather than sustained military commitment. May 2025, Moscow pledged approximately $1 billion investment in Cuba's economy, implementation details vague. Cuba remains key Russian foreign policy partner following 2022 Ukraine invasion and Western isolation. Russian crude oil supplies provide Cuban lifeline. Wheat supplies ameliorate food security crisis. For Russia, Cuba offers demonstration of retained influence in Western Hemisphere. What Russian signaling reveals: strategic messaging over operational commitment, submarine deployments, military agreements, investment pledges primarily serve to evoke Cold War imagery, signal to Washington that Moscow retains global reach, actual capabilities constrained by Ukraine war resource drain, blue water navy limitations. But even symbolic deployments of nuclear-capable submarines create escalation pathways if miscommunication or political calculation goes awry. Russia sends submarines to signal great power status. China builds signal intelligence facilities for actual intelligence collection. Both approaches converge in Cuba. Both create contingency scenarios requiring US planning. Let's examine what happens if Cuba's regime falls and these facilities suddenly become accessible or need destroying before they change hands. Scenario 1. Rapid Chinese intelligence asset evacuation. Russian Lords precedent. 3 AN-124 heavy lift aircraft, approximately 30 days single facility. China faces 4 facilities with more sophisticated equipment than Cold War-era Lords. PLA Air Force operates Gen Y-20 strategic transport. Maximum payload approximately 66 tons versus AN-124's 150 tons. What needs extraction? CDAA systems, 19 antennas at Bajucal, projected 130 to 200 meter array at El Salao. Underground facility contents, redundant communication equipment across 4 locations, control stations, electrical generation equipment. Critically, intelligence databases, collection logs, communication archives, multiple cargo sorties over extended period versus rapid extraction. Even with multiple Y-20s, evacuation requires weeks, assuming Cuban airspace remains accessible. Maritime evacuation. PLA Navy lacks purpose-built roll-on roll-off cargo vessels of sufficient capacity. Distance challenge, approximately 13,000 kilometers via Panama Canal, or 16,000 kilometers around Cape Horn. Transit time, 25 to 30 days. Vulnerability, extended maritime transit vulnerable to US naval interdiction. US maintains overwhelming maritime superiority throughout region. Decision trigger, when would China decide to evacuate? If Cuban regime faces imminent collapse or political circumstances shift dramatically toward US alignment. Critical question, how much advance warning? Sudden military coup provides minimal warning, hours to days. Prolonged deterioration potentially allows weeks. Would collapsing regime facilitate Chinese evacuation or cooperate with US? Scenario 2. Hostile US facility seizure and sensitive site exploitation. Specialist teams needed: signals intelligence exploitation specialists, communication security analysts, technical signals analysts, damage assessment experts. US military developed substantial expertise during Afghanistan and Iraq operations. Priority intelligence targets, equipment in operational condition where feasible, intelligence databases and archives preventing destruction, technical signals analysis hardware and software, collection logs indicating tasking and frequency selection, communication protocols coordinating with Chinese analysis centers, organizational charts identifying operatives and Cuban collaborators. Bajucal, largest complex underground facilities visible on southern perimeter, Underground components may contain most sensitive materials, require breaching operations if entrance is secured or destroyed. El Salao. Construction largely ceased. Facility not fully operational. May contain construction plans and technical specifications. Wajay and Calabazar. Smaller facilities, but 12+ antennas suggest complex mission sets. Each requires separate SSE team deployment. Time pressure. Race against scorched earth. If Chinese or Cuban operatives receive advance warning, they implement destruction protocols before US forces arrive. Even hours of warning could allow demolition of most recoverable intelligence value. US would prioritize rapid seizure to minimize destruction window. Helicopter-borne teams could reach multiple facilities near simultaneously operating from Guantanamo Bay. Scenario 3. Scorched Earth. Protocols and equipment destruction. Destruction protocols target. Electromagnetic demolition. High explosives destroy antenna systems. Thermite destruction of electronic equipment. Control systems. Data destruction. Incineration of document archives. Magnetic media. Modern solid-state drives rendered unrecoverable through cryptographic key destruction, milliseconds, or physical destruction, minutes. Facility demolition. Controlled explosives demolish underground facilities, render above-ground structures non-operational. With advance warning, days. Systematic dismantling and destruction, thoroughness prioritized. Chinese personnel could evacuate most portable sensitive materials, destroy remainder in place. Limited warning, hours. Focus on data destruction. Demolition charges pre-positioned on critical systems. Minimal warning, minutes. Emergency cryptographic key destruction. Small arms fire into critical electronics. Thermite grenades on server rooms. Military Necessity Doctrine, 1977. Geneva Conventions prohibit certain scorched earth practices, but military necessity provides legal justification for destroying installations directly supporting military operations. Signal intelligence facilities directly support military operations, destroying them before adversary seizure falls within accepted doctrine. Scenario 4. Cuban Missile Crisis 2.0. Nuclear Strategic Escalation. June 2024. Precedent. Kazan nuclear submarine deployment demonstrated Russia's capacity to project nuclear platforms into US proximate waters. Kazan and Admiral Gorshkov carry long-range strike capabilities, caliber cruise missiles, 1,000+ nautical mile range. Russian and Cuban officials emphasized no nuclear warheads deployed, but technical capacity not in question. Caliber and Onyx missiles possess optional nuclear warhead capability. Escalatory triggers. US military operations extending to Russian personnel at Cuban facilities could rapidly escalate armed confrontation. Russian military reinforcement responding to US regime change operations, deploying additional naval assets as demonstration. Miscalculation in dense military environment. June 2024 concentration. 3 US destroyers, multiple frigates, patrol aircraft, nuclear submarine versus Russian nuclear submarine, frigate, support vessels. Even peacetime concentration creates collision and misidentification risks. 1962. Cuban Missile Crisis Lessons. 13 days at thermonuclear brink demonstrated how quickly surveillance infrastructure disputes in Cuba escalate to existential crisis. Soviet nuclear missile deployment triggered US naval blockade, nuclear bomber alert, preparation for invasion. Crisis resolved through back-channel negotiations, Soviet missile removal, secret US missile removal from Turkey. Key variables. Clear communication between Washington and Moscow, both leaderships prioritizing de-escalation, specific negotiated resolution. Variables that might not apply 2026. Maduro capture demonstrates Trump administration willingness to use military force for regime change in hemisphere. No clear communication protocol exists for facility seizure scenario. Russian military limitations make negotiated resolution less obvious. Chinese involvement adds third great power, complicates bilateral resolution models. What prevents Cuban Missile Crisis 2.0? Russian military limitations. Moscow acknowledges inability to contest US dominance in Caribbean. Chinese calculations. Beijing prioritizes avoiding direct confrontation. Trump administration ambiguity. Alternates between Cuba ready to fall rhetoric and "I think we're going to make a deal" statements. What makes escalation more likely than 1962? Three great powers instead of bilateral framework. Operational tempo of facility seizure compresses timeline versus 1962 blockade. Absence of clear negotiation framework for three-way facility removal coordination. 4 scenarios. Different timelines, different escalation risks. All grounded in technical realities. Y-20 payload capacities, SSE team requirements, scorched earth demolition protocols, submarine standoff precedents, geographic advantage as enduring constant, Soviet lords, Chinese four-facility network, Russian reactivation, all exploit same fundamental reality. Cuba sits 90 miles south of Florida, with elevated positions commanding sightlines to major US military concentrations. Technical advantage unavailable elsewhere. China cannot replicate Florida space launch telemetry collection from Chinese territory. Russia cannot monitor Central Command and Southern Command headquarters from Vladivostok. The dependency calculation each power makes. China's assessment. Cuban signal intelligence access closes strategic gap in North American coverage. Intelligence value justifies political risk of US reaction. Economic investment despite Cuban regime instability. Contingency planning for potential facility loss. Russia's assessment. Cuban presence demonstrates retained great power status. Symbolic value justifies limited economic support, occasional naval deployments, intelligence cooperation renewal. Cuba's assessment. Hosting Chinese and Russian facilities provides regime survival support through economic assistance, diplomatic protection, demonstration of alternatives to US alignment. Why escalation risks don't prevent facility expansion. Rational risk acceptance. Each power conducts cost-benefit analysis concluding intelligence and strategic value exceed escalation risks. Historical precedent normalization. Lords operated 37 years without triggering US military seizure. Incremental expansion versus sudden deployment. Chinese facility construction occurred gradually 2019 to 2025 rather than sudden revelation. The facility lifecycle pattern, establishment, peak operation, potential closure and evacuation, gap period, reactivation, renewed operation. Why surveillance infrastructure survives regime changes. Physical facilities represent sunk investment. Geographic advantage persists regardless of operator. Technical capabilities retain value across geopolitical contexts. Precedent for return. Russia's Lords, reactivation. 12 years after closure demonstrates even complete facility evacuation doesn't permanently eliminate surveillance presence. What contingency scenarios reveal evacuation logistics as strategic vulnerability? China's lack of heavy lift capacity matching AN-124 specifications, maritime transit vulnerability to US interdiction, multi-week extraction timeline expose fundamental asymmetry. Scorched earth as equalizer. Despite US military superiority, Chinese and Cuban destruction protocols can deny intelligence value, even if US forces physically seize facilities. Nuclear escalation as persistent background risk. Presence of nuclear-capable submarines during crisis creates escalation pathways. This isn't about debating whether China should operate signal intelligence facilities 90 miles from Florida. It's about documenting how surveillance architecture that everyone knows produces escalatory risks, evacuation races, facility seizure scenarios, potential nuclear brinkmanship, keeps getting expanded by powers claiming strategic necessity. The pattern repeats because geographic advantage persists. Intelligence value justifies political risk, and precedent normalizes arrangements that would seem intolerable if proposed fresh. 4 active signal intelligence facilities at specific locations. Technical specifications from satellite imagery. CDAA diameters, antenna counts, underground facilities, construction timelines. Collection capabilities. 3,000 to 8,000 mile signal tracking range, satellite downlink interception, coverage of approximately 20 Florida military installations. Historical precedent. 37-year Lords operation, 2002 evacuation, 12-year gap, 2014 reactivation, Chinese expansion as Project 141 template, Russian symbolic signaling through nuclear submarine deployments, contingency scenarios grounded in technical realities, the persistence puzzle answered. Why does surveillance infrastructure keep getting expanded despite escalation risks? Because each power calculates intelligence value exceeds risks, geographic advantage creates enduring collection value, historical precedent normalizes risk, incremental expansion avoids sudden crisis threshold. Why does infrastructure survive regime changes? Because physical installations represent sunk investment retaining value across geopolitical contexts. Positioning advantage persists regardless of operator. Precedent demonstrates even complete evacuation doesn't permanently eliminate surveillance presence. What makes 2026 different? 3 great powers instead of bilateral competition. Operational tempo compresses timeline. Cuban regime instability creates facility control uncertainty. Absence of clear negotiation protocol. February 2026 status. Regime faces economic collapse. US surged 11,000 troops. Chinese facilities remain operational but vulnerable. The Lord's Protocol, race to secure or destroy surveillance infrastructure before it changes hands, involves competing timelines. By March or April 2026, we'll know whether regime survived, negotiated transition, collapsed into chaos. We'll know whether Chinese facilities remained operational, were evacuated intact, underwent scorched earth destruction, got seized with recoverable intelligence. CSIS satellite imagery, April 2025. Bejukal CDAA, construction. Ongoing, El Salau construction largely ceased, but infrastructure intact. Wajeh and Kalabazar operational with recent modernization. What we determine versus uncertainties. Facility locations, technical specifications, construction timelines confirmed. Personnel numbers, specific targets, data sharing protocols remain uncertain. What technical characteristics reveal? Not telecommunications infrastructure, high-frequency direction finding optimized for tracking signals across thousands of miles. The verdict: surveillance architecture everyone knows produces escalatory risks, keeps getting expanded by powers claiming strategic necessity. Cuba became focal point where Cold War surveillance architecture, post-Soviet intelligence collapse, and 21st century great power competition converge. Not because any power planned that convergence, because 90 miles south of Florida remains optimal position for monitoring what happens 90 miles north. By the time you're watching this, the countdown status may have changed, but whether China evacuates, US seizes facilities, or regime survives another crisis, the fundamental pattern, surveillance infrastructure's persistence despite everyone acknowledging where it leads, will remain. That's the Lord's Protocol. That's the puzzle that doesn't get solved, only reset for the next cycle. It's February 2026. 4 signal intelligence facilities operational. Regime countdown continues. The race to secure China's spy base hasn't started yet, but the contingency timelines are already running. The verdict's still out. But the technical specifications, the evacuation logistics, the facility seizure protocols, the nuclear escalation pathways, those aren't speculation.